Thanks for the download. Before we start this episode, it'd be great if you could rate the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from, as this helps me know how we're doing, if the content is hitting the mark, and also helps bring it to the attention of potential listeners. If you do like the pod and like to support it, then you can check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, which helps with ongoing costs such as website hosting. My guest today is former soldier and author of Fire Force, Chris Cox. Fire Force is my book choice in this episode, and it's a no-holds-barred and brutal account of his service in 3 Commando. Former soldiers will recognise a black humour in the face of adversity, alongside the often visceral account of close combat and death in the African bush. Chris was born in Salisbury, southern Rhodesia in 1957, and in 1976 he was conscripted for national service and ended up serving 3 years in Rhodesian Light Infantry, the RLI as it was known. He then served a further 18 months with the police anti-terrorist unit. The RLI was an elite commando regiment formed in 1961 and played a pivotal role throughout the conflict, which took place from 1964 to 1979. Originally conceived as a conventional infantry unit, the RLI involved a specialised counterinsurgency force renowned for the relentless pursuit of guerrilla fighters. The ranks of the RLI consist of regular soldiers, national servicemen, reservists and foreign volunteers from all around the world, but their tactics, techniques and procedures were limited to what the country could afford to obtain in the face of rigid international sanctions. This led to the development of a highly mobile, aggressive Fire Force operational concept, which used helicopters and paratroopers to great effect and earned them a formidable reputation as they fought a large guerrilla force and inflicted a heavy price of their enemy with an estimated ratio of 35 enemy casualties per each of their own. Despite these battlefield successes, a small isolated country like Rhodesia could not sustain the cost in treasure and manpower of a high-intensity counterinsurgency campaign. In 1979, British brokered all-party talks led to a peace agreement and a new constitution guaranteeing minority rights. The following year, ZANU leader Robert Mugabe won independence elections and the now Zimbabwe gained international recognition in April of that year. On this pod, we'll explore the stories behind their tactics, training and procedures and the complex legacy they left behind as one of the world's most efficient military units. Let's crack on. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Chris. In your book Fire Force, you write, "I had not volunteered for the army. A year's national service seemed an awful long time for a boy of 18, and at one stage I was determined to evade it. I knew little of politics, but my parents used to vote against Ian Smith and his Rhodesian Front Party, and I'd been to a multiracial private school where I'd grown up with blacks, and it felt unjust that they were not allowed to represent the school at sports when we were competing against whites-only government schools. Some black kids were my good friends, and in my youthful mind I vaguely appreciated that something had to be radically wrong with the apartheid policies of the Rhodesian Front. Yet I still went and fought for the green and white flag of Rhodesia, and I was certainly no patriot. I still cannot understand it, even to this day." You're conscripted in January 76. How did an 18-year-old from a liberal family, with mixed feelings about the cause, and flat feet that could have exempted him from military service, end up as an RLI commando?
Hi, Colin. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, good question. I think it was, conscription obviously was compulsory for all white kids. As soon as you turned 18, you were eligible for national service. I was determined I was going to run away, basically, flee. But in the end, it was kind of peer pressure and the fact that I'd be bringing shame upon my family if I were to evade national service. Flat feet had been a cause for exemption up until the end of 1975, but by 1975 they were taking anybody. So flat feet was not a cause for exemption. So that's how I got into conscription, into the military. ended up in RLI simply because that was where I was instructed to report to. The RLI at that stage was desperately short of manpower, and so they were looking at taking a national serviceman as well. Yeah, so that's how I ended up in RLI.
Reading through your book, I understand there were sort of three facets to the military out there. You had the conscripts, i.e. national service, you had reservists, and you had regular soldiers. Was that the basic components of the army out there?
That's correct, yeah. You had the national servicemen. When I went in January 1976, national service was for 12 months. That very soon increased to 18 months, and soon after that increased to 2 years. Once a guy had done his national service, he then was transferred onto the reserve or the territorials. That's what I think the Brits call them as well. And they were all the Rhodesia Regiment units. They had 10 battalions of territorials, all part-timers. Then there were the regular aspects of the Rhodesian Army. The Rhodesian Light Infantry was one regular unit, and the Rhodesian African Rifles was a regular unit. That was the black unit with 2 battalions. Selous Scouts were generally regular, and the SAS were generally regular as well. So yes, national service, territorials, and regular army.
It's interesting that I often say in the podcast that we talk about soldiers and the soldiering, and we try and keep the politics out of it. But it's really hard to do that in any podcast, never mind this one. I think it was Klaus that said, war is extension of politics by other means. But I was interested to see that you had whole battalions of black soldiers in the RAR. The motivation of those guys, what motivated them to fight for Rhodesia?
It was a job. It was a good job. I don't think there were any political motivation whatsoever from the blacks joining the army. Black troops had been in the Rhodesian army since First World War, where they'd fought in East Africa. In Second World War, they fought in the Far East, Burma, Malaya. So they'd all traditionally been a quite significant component of black troops in the Rhodesian army. But yeah, I don't think it was anything about any sort of political motivation. It was just it was a really good job.
I mean, that's interesting. And one of the reasons I joined the army back here in the 80s was to get a job. So those motivational factors, I think, are a strand throughout military history.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me in your book was how familiar the training, language, discipline and equipment was in Rhodesia to the British Army I served in the 80s, and even some of the aspects of the operations you conducted against the enemy. And I think this demonstrates the close contacts that Rhodesia had with the UK before UDI during that period. And, Rhodesia contributed a lot of people during the Second World War for a small nation. We did a podcast, the Long Range Desert Group, and there's quite a few Rhodesians in the Long Range Desert Group. So Rhodesia has a proud history of fighting, as a proud association with UK prior to this period. And your training was in 3 phases, really. Basic training, what you call classical war training, and counterinsurgency training. Can you tell me about your basic and classical war training first?
Yeah, you're right. Our whole training process was based very much on the British Army. Well, I mean, almost identical. We called things slightly different, but yeah, very much the same. Each phase of the training was around 6 weeks. So your basic training was 6 weeks. That was effectively what I think a boot camp is what the Americans would call it. But yeah, basic training. That's 6 weeks of fitness, drill, discipline, that kind of thing. That lasted 6 weeks. Classical war training, also 6 weeks phase, was going through all the operations of involved in what we call classical warfare, conventional warfare, section battle drills, company battle drills, endurance marches, digging trenches and all that kind of stuff. The drill obviously continued all through this phase of the operation. Yeah, and that finished off with quite a large exercise with all the recruits, about 600 of us, split into 2, red and blue, on a military exercise with Air Force support, close air support. Yeah, and that was a fairly large exercise, and that brought to the end the classical war training phase. And then the last phase was counterinsurgency, 6 weeks as well.
I did laugh in your book because the soldiers' traditional disdain for officers came out quite clearly when I think you had some officers from the Officer Training Academy come in and command you, and there was one particularly obnoxious one. You and your mates did your best to sort of muck up his command appointment.
Yeah, I think it's very much the same in the British Army. I mean, I think you guys used to call them rupits.
That's right, yeah.
We had national service officers as well. Most officers, regular officers, did a 1-year training course, whereas national service officers did the same as us, basically 18 weeks, 4 months or so. And we felt they were kind of basically just retreated national servicemen. So unfair, but a lot of them were very good, but a lot weren't.
In your book, it's quite clear that you didn't really enjoy those first 2 phases, but certainly when you moved to the coin phase, that was something you enjoyed much more. And you wrote, "We relished the counterinsurgency training. It was a type of warfare in which we could be engaged, and we began to feel closer to reality. We practiced the jungle lane so often that snap shooting at hidden targets became second nature to us. That was fortunate, for this exercise more than any other was to save countless lives and account for hundreds of dead guerrillas." Can you just expand a little bit on this phase of the training for us? As it says, counterinsurgency, all aspects of counterinsurgency, from conducting OPs, training for that, tracking formations, walking through the bush, all this kind of thing. And of course, shooting was the whole time shooting was an important aspect of training, apart from the conventional shooting on range shooting, snap shooting, as I say. It was amazing that the jungle lane, as we call it, it really did hone our skills into open-eyed shooting, as some people call it. We also did a lot of stuff, like we went on like a survival course where we got thrown into bush for a week with no food, and we had to try and survive, that kind of stuff. We've been taught all sorts of supposed bush skills on how to catch animals and what berries you can eat and all that kind of stuff. They were a bit of a waste of time because we were clueless. But all that kind of stuff, counterinsurgency, anti-ambush drills, this sort of thing. Ambushes, vehicle ambushes and landmines were a major tactic of the guerrillas. And so, we did a lot of that. And they're then into practicing fire force drills, how to get on and off a helicopter, that kind of thing. Is that where you did your 120k final march as well? Is that the...
Yes, it was, yeah.
Could you just give people a flavour for that? Because that was quite an endurance, literally an endurance.
Yeah, again, we got dumped in the bush. It was communal areas. So there were people there. It was what we called tribal trust lands, which is where the rural areas reserved for black tribes people. And we got dumped in an area there, and we had to, I think it was 120 mile, and we had to achieve like 20 miles a day from one point to the next. There would be an instructor waiting at the end of that. If you didn't get there on time or you failed to achieve that, you wouldn't get your food. With heavy packs, loaded down, and that's what you had to do, 20 miles a day, which, later on, that's not that much, but in the heat of Africa, it was pretty tough, but we did it.
Look at the enemy then. Your 2 major enemy groups were the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, ZANLA, the armed wing of the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, and the Zimbabwean People's Revolutionary Army, known as ZIPRA, which was the armed wing of the Zimbabwe African People's Union. What were their tactics, and how effective were they as a guerrilla force?
Yeah, good question. To get with all these Zimbabwean African, it got quite complicated. ZANLA, which was Mugabe's crowd, and ZIPRA, which was Joshua Nkomo's army. ZANLA were based in Mozambique, supported by primarily the Chinese in terms of weaponry and supplies and uniforms and things like that, but also to The East Germans would also support them. The Tanzanians, were supporting them as a guerrilla force. And then there was ZIPRA, who were based in Zambia, to the north of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. They were primarily Soviet and Cuban trained and supplied. ZIPRA were a lot more of a conventional force. They were preparing essentially for the day when there would be a conventional armed invasion of the country. However, they did conduct guerrilla warfare with infiltration into the country. They were fairly daunting as an enemy, quite fearless. Zanla, we were the Chinese-based, Chinese-supplied liberation movement, and they were almost wholly guerrilla warfare based. They would infiltrate the country in groups of, 50, 100 people, 100 guerrillas or more, and then split into smaller groups and move into the various rural areas where they would essentially take control over that particular area. And they sort of slowly infiltrated the country in that manner. How effective they were? I would say they were both quite effective. ZIPRA, as a conventional army, eventually saw their backsides when they invaded to become Zimbabwe in 81 and were taken out by the government of Zimbabwe, the armored columns. But as guerrilla forces, they're both very effective. Confrontation with Rhodesian security forces was not one of their tactics. They tended to avoid confrontation. They were more on kind of attacking lonely Rhodesian outposts, farms, that sort of thing. But subverting the population was their main tactic, their strategy rather. They obviously, landmines, as I say, were a huge component of their tactics. And attacking, ambushing civilian vehicles, ambushing army vehicles, attacking police outposts and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you can draw parallels between the ARVN, the sort of the regular component in Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. And there's sort of a few parallels running with Vietnam cutting through your book as well. We'll explore some of them later on in the podcast. So once training was over and you're posted to an RLI commando, the main duty really was manning fire forces, or in today's terms, a quick reaction force. Can you explain the concept of operations and structure of a fire force?
Okay, 76 was when the whole fire force concept came of age. It had been started in 1974 with the first major guerrilla incursions into the country, and it had sort of honed its effectiveness in those 2 years. We were on a situation when we were sent to an operational base in the bush that half the commando would be on fire force operations, the other half of the commando would go on patrol and that sort of thing, on OPs and all that kind of stuff. A fire force, very, very simple operation, airborne, air mobile operation. In 70, sort of three main phases of the fire force, 76 to 78. There were sort of 4 helicopters involved, a command helicopter called the K-car, and 3 what they called G-cars, which were troop-carrying G-cars that served as gunships as well. They would, we would react to a guerrilla sighting or incident, or however the guerrillas had been tracked down, and we would send out these 4 helicopters. So 4 men in each troop-carrying helicopter, so 12 men altogether, and then the K-car command helicopter with the ground commander, normally the commander major, and the head of the Air Force component flying the helicopter. They'd be armed with a 20mm cannon, arrive overhead of the area, start opening fire with the 20mm cannon. At the same time, air support in terms of a little ground attack aircraft. We called it a Lynx, which was a little Ream Cessna push-pull job, came in with white phosphorus, Neb rockets, napalm, and cannon fire to take out the guerrillas. And at the same time, the 3 helicopters, the troop-carrying helicopters, were dropped around the guerrillas to act as stop groups, the various escape routes. The G cars would then scurry back to get more troops, a second wave of troops. In the later phases of Fire Force from 1977 onwards, there would be a parachute component which could drop 16 to 20 troops in one hit. That came into force as well, which transformed the Fire Force considerably, getting a lot more men on the ground more quickly.
The use of helicopters as in all operations was mainly down to the large tracts of area to be covered. And we've already covered how those helicopters operated. And you touched on the fact that you started parachuting ops from Dakotas in 76 to deploy more men on the ground quickly. And I got the impression, I read in the book, a lot of this was down to sanctions against Rhodesia that stopped you getting more airframes. How did you feel?
Sorry.
And that impacted everything, didn't it? From airframes to weapons, that type of thing.
Exactly. I mean, our little Alouette 3s, which were the helicopters we used, I think in 79, they bought, the Rhodesian government managed to get hold of some Bell Hueys bought from some dodgy Israeli arms dealer. They arrived in the country. But yeah, absolutely. Equipment and air resources were always at a major premium, a problem. Until I think 76 and even later, we had the South African Air Force were supplying helicopters and pilots to assist. The South Africans used that as a bit of a carrot and a stick in terms of a political settlement. And if Rhodesia was being difficult, that withdraw their helicopters and support. Yeah, definitely. I mean, sanctions impacted absolutely every aspect of the Rhodesian Army's operations. 99% of our ammunition came from South Africa. All our clothing and webbing were all locally made, appalling quality. The webbing sort of fell apart at the drop of a hat as soon as a bit of weight and a bit of pressure and a bit of moisture. Our clothing was ditto, fairly second rate. Again, locally made in Rhodesia. Boots were okay. Our standard infantry boots were pretty solid, but they were heavy, and they left a distinct spoor, a track. So we tended not to wear them. We used them in the earlier days when we were parachuting. They came up with, in terms of footwear, they came up with this wonderful idea of, we called them clandestine tackies. Tackies is a sort of local word for track shoes, basically, tennis shoes. And these clandestine tackies had no tread. So this was a cunning idea that would fox the guerrillas into thinking there were no, or the civilians in the rural areas to think there were no security forces in the area. But all it did was confirm that there were, because if you saw a footprint with no track, you knew it was security force. And apart from that, they were extremely treacherous with no tread. So, slippery, useless things.
We can't talk about clothing without mentioning the infamous nutcracker shorts. And I got the impression it's always amazed me that you were thrashing through the bush in those shorts and didn't end up with your legs cut to ribbons and that type of thing. But the Rhodesian light infantry had a very relaxed attitude to dress, which seemed to go in phases. When you're doing your training, the discipline in your training in the early days was quite harsh, and that included how you dressed. Then you seem to go to a phase where you are wearing T-shirts and shorts on patrol, and then it seemed to clamp down again at a later stage. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah. I mean, the casual aspect of wearing T-shirts and nutcracker shorts, as you call them, and tackies or trainers, that went back to the what they call the border control days, when the Rhodesian Army operations were all mainly in the Zambezi Valley, where it was stinking hot. And that goes back to then. It carried on through when I went in, it was sort of slowly fading out, and certainly with paratraining, the shorts and T-shirts didn't normally cut it. although you could still jump in that if you wanted to. So we were issued with jumpsuits, para jumpsuits with like just overalls. Again, poor quality, but a good piece of kit. And the other aspect that forced us to improve our dress was camouflage. It became modus operandi that we had to break up our outline. So any piece of pale skin had to be camouflaged with camouflage cream. And obviously, if you're wearing shorts, you had to camouflage all your legs, and your arms. And so it became more of a convenient thing. So we ended up wearing mainly our jumpsuits, but also sometimes just ordinary combat trousers or whatever. Yeah. So it definitely improved our dressability, and as you say, stopped the cuts and landing on a plow, for example. It will, para jumping definitely improved.
And looking at weapons, again, go back to the 80s. In the current climate where 5.56 is a round of choice, so that is changing now due to Afghanistan, and we're moving up to bigger calibers. But the main weapons of choice for you guys was the FN, or the SLR, as most people would know it, and what you called the MAG, which British listeners would be familiar as the general purpose machine gun. And you tended to operate, if I recall rightly, in teams of 4, and a lot of time you had one GPMG or a MAG and 3 riflemen with FNs or SLRs. Is that correct?
Pretty much so. The SLR kind of faded out in the early 60s when the FN, FAL came in. As you say, same weapon. The FN was just slightly different in that different flash hider. It had that chunky flash hider, and it had the carrying handle cut off. Yeah, so it was mainly the FN was the infantry weapon of choice. There were a lot of SLRs still in the country. Those tended to go to the territorials or the police reserve units, or the various guard force internal affairs type units. Of course, the trick was to somehow get hold of a folding butt FN, which we normally had to capture those from the guerrillas. And then, as you say, the MAG, which was what we called it, which was the same as the Brit GPMG. When the RLI converted from a basic infantry battalion with sections and platoons and companies to a commando unit, which was pretty much not a lot of difference, but sections were done away with. Instead, we had the 4-man stick. The platoon became a troop, and the company became a commando. And private soldiers or riflemen became troopers. That was really the only difference. The 4-man stick was dictated by the carrying capacity of the Alouette 3. So that became the smallest or the basic unit, as you say, with 3 riflemen and an MAG gunner. So as opposed to a section having an MAG gun, every stick had an MAG gunner. So on a fire force, there was quite a lot of firepower with those MAGs. The stick leaders ranged from second lieutenants all the way down to senior troopers. Generally, mostly were junior NCOs, lance corporals and corporals. And in many respects, that's why it was called a corporals war, because the corporals, or the lance corporals, junior NCOs, had a lot of control over what they could do.
Yeah, it's interesting. That, again, drawing parallels, that was very similar to Northern Ireland. I mean, we're comparing apples and pears with degrees of intensity, but very much Northern Ireland was described as a section commander's war as well.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. The sort of support weapons, we had support commando, which was the support aspect of the battalion. They did all the bigger stuff, the big mortars, that sort of thing. The most we got to handle, I think, was like the 60 or 61 millimeter mortar. I never know the difference. I know one's a guerrilla and one's not. We had the 3.5 inch rocket launcher, can you believe, which was a fairly cumbersome thing. I mean, I think I only used that once in action, and that was on our conventional raid into Mozambique. All the SAS and the Salute Scouts were all exclusively using captured guerrilla weapons like RPG-7s, that sort of thing, AKs, RPDs, all that sort of thing. So we were stuck with a little bit of both. We did get to get RPG-7s later on, but yeah, we pretty well FN and MAG were our basic infantry weapons.
We discussed parachuting earlier on. How did you find paratraining and what were the operational jumps like?
The reason parachuting came into being was simply because, as we alluded to earlier, there were just not enough helicopters to transport troops to the action. If we'd had, like the South Africans, they had their Oryxes and they had their Pumas and that sort of thing. They didn't need paratroopers. And that's the only reason why we began paratrooping operations. And it became, by 1977, that the whole battalion had to be parachute trained. And it became a thing at the end of a recruit's training course that he had to do his parachute training course before he went to the commandos. The actual parachuting itself, training was conducted at the New Serum Air Base, the main Air Force base, just south of Salisbury. Very much, absolutely 100% based on the British parachute training courses. In fact, most of our instructors were British, a couple of Australians and a couple of Americans, but mainly British. The paratraining was excellent, pretty thorough, pretty basic. It only took 2 weeks. You had to do your nine jumps to get your wings, and those 9 jumps included 1 night jump and 1 water jump, which was a bit hairy. But it was a good course. We did most of our jumps on training from, I think it was from 1,000 feet. Out of Dakotas, the C-47s. Then going into the operational jumps, a little bit of a different scenario. Number one, we had to work out how did we attach our MAG and our FNs to our kit. As you would know, the MAG is a pretty bulky, awkward piece of kit. So we would try to work our ways to, it had to basically strap it into our harness, our harness setup, but it was very cumbersome. And the FN not so bad. That was a little bit more streamlined. But you're jumping like that, and all operation jumps were done from 500 feet, often because of weather conditions, wind, or the pilot. It would be lower than that. So you're jumping with an MAG into sort of high wind conditions, sometimes with no recognized DZ below. It just dropped you in the bush, and they obviously did look for open bits of ground, but not always the case. And so you were jumping into rocks and trees and, as I mentioned earlier, farm machinery and equipment and that sort of thing, and loaded down with an MAG. It was quite hairy. There was always an injury on operational jumps. There were the occasion, I think it was when RAR were doing an operational jump in the Zambezi Valley, that they actually suffered deaths and certainly several injuries and broken legs and things like that. But you got used to it. But 500 feet, little point in a reserve chute at that sort of level, and you came down like a rock. You really did, and you had very little time to actually practice your side left and side right, and all the landings you'd been taught at jump school. Yeah.
You became a dispatcher later on as well, didn't you?
Yeah, again, that was because of manpower shortages. The Air Force didn't have enough people to do dispatching and training. Every Dakota had to have an Air Force senior dispatcher on board, plus 1 to 2 junior dispatchers. So yeah, I went on a dispatching course and taught people, threw people out of airplanes, basically.
You described your first operation in contact in your book as follows. Corporal Seward spotted what looked to me like a bundle of rags beneath a bush. In an instant, his rifle was at his shoulder, and he fired 3 or 4 quick shots. The bundle grunted, and as it rolled over, a communist AK-47 rifle clattered to the side. I was astonished. So that was a guerrilla. The bundle had seemed so inoffensive. I studied the body curiously. Still smouldering napalm had bored ugly holes into the flesh, which gave off a sickly sweet smell. The skull had been shattered by a bullet, and brains were oozing through the scalp in a riot of blood and gore. The mouth was fixed in a grimace of death, while the eyes stared upward as if in a trance. So this was death. Pretty unsparing first dealings with realities of soldiering there. Can you talk me through that first operation and what it was like for you?
Yeah, I think the word astonished. I was absolutely gobsmacked that this is what happened. I think my whole being at the time, from the moment we got dropped from the Alouette and we shook out into a sort of mini sweep line, the four of us, my whole concentration was focused on doing the right thing. That I would not get ahead of the MAG gunner, that we'd maintain our dressing, looking at the stick leader the whole time to see what he was doing. But they kind of just sort of let me get on with it. And they went sort of cruising through the bush there after the airstrike. And then this happened. And I thought, well, there was no warning that this was going to happen. I was absolutely amazed that this was how it all worked. It was all a little bit of a dream, and that, as I say, I was mainly I had no idea of the sort of expectation of what it would be like. And I actually saw a friend of mine at Mount Darwin at the police station after this, and I said, Graham, it's just nothing like we'd been trained for, nothing like we'd been led to. Obviously we'd received the training to deal with this sort of thing, but it was nothing like I'd been expecting. So it was very much a wake-up call.
It's interesting because later on in your book, you describe you're now an experienced soldier. I think you were a section commander at this time, or a stick commander. And in your book, you talk about the toil of that concentration. And I can't remember what it was now, but your mind was wandering, and one of your oppos behind you snapshot a guerrilla in front of you. And you then expanded on how the concentration that's required on a patrol if it wavers for a second, it can cost you your life. And I thought that was a good illustration of that, of how complacency can kill.
Absolutely. And complacency favors no one at all. And, if you're not, we had a really sort of cheesy cliche, it was switch on in the bush, which kind of said it all. You had to be absolutely on your best lookout the whole time. And we've been taught as well, when sort of advancing through the bush, where might someone be hiding? Where might the guerrillas be? Sometimes we did clearing fire, not always, but we did do that sometimes. The whole time, absolutely switch on, you're in the bush.
Yeah, and for civilians who are listening, you can watch a film, or you can watch a documentary, but what you can't do is get into the mind of the soldier on a patrol. So you're patrolling along, you're looking for threat points, you're looking at positions on the ground, right? If we get contacted from the right here, I'm going to move to the left here. If you're a section commander, you're thinking in 3 dimensions. You're thinking about air. If you've got artillery or mortars, you're thinking about bringing them in. You've got to know where you are all the time. You're keeping eyes on the right and left of you for your men, making sure they're okay. And that is mentally exhausting. And I think often that doesn't get brought across when people talk about soldiering in those types of environments.
Absolutely, Colin. You put it so well. I think that the whole time I was sort of advancing in the bush, it was, what will you do or where will you go if the enemy opens fire? That the whole time, and it changes from step to step, and of course your eyes are sort of looking through cover and everything like that, trying to identify where the enemy is, and that's where a lot of our training came in handy, looking for anything that's unusual in the bush: shape, shine, shadow, silhouette, all those S's. Absolutely, all the time. And it's exhausting.
We talked about a few parallels with Vietnam, and in your book, one of them you mention is a focus on body count, but also that troops regularly smoked dope and even appropriated drugs from medics. Looking back, do you think this need to self-medicate came about from the strain of the operations, or was it something else?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when I say regularly, it depended.
That was probably my word, Chris, so I apologise.
No. Yeah, it was very common, and weed was common with the guerrillas and Rhodesian forces, but more as a sort of recreational type drug. I don't think we felt there was any need to sort of self-medicate. We hadn't got to that stage yet. It was done really just to get high, just to have a good time. I don't think it affected our combat ability. We tended not to do it going into combat, although some did. So it was really done when you're back at base and that sort of thing.
An army now, people are getting flung out left, right and centre for any sort of drug taking or whatever. Was it just a blind eye turn to it, as long as it didn't affect your operations, as you said, or if you'd have been caught, would you have been severely disciplined?
Yes, we would have. Certainly the officer corps were all pretty conventional, conservative Rhodesian type guys. Some of the foreign officers weren't so conventional, but yeah, the Rhodesian officers were very, very conservative, and yeah, you absolutely would have been severely disciplined or thrown out of the commando. They knew it was happening. They tended not to try and get too staunch on it, but yeah, they definitely would have disciplined you.
In your book, you describe some of the techniques used by the Rhodesian Special Branch against the guerrillas. And some of them would be familiar to Northern Ireland veterans, like what we used to call jarking radios and other desirable items with trackers. Can you just talk us through some of these techniques, including use of poison clothing that you encountered once on a patrol?
Yeah, definitely. Our Special Branch were masters at this kind of warfare. One of the major ways of tracking down guerrilla groups was guerrillas would go into an area and they would rob a store, a rural store, for example, and they'd always take radios, transistor radios and that sort of thing, many of which had been jimmied by Special Branch and included tracking devices. And I would call that, and that became a major component in tracking down guerrillas with this little tracking device in their transistor radios. It was called Roadrunner. That's right, and accounted for many successful Fire Force call-outs, Roadrunner like that. Jarking, I think that's when you put some sort of explosive or something, eh?
I think in Northern Ireland it was mainly to do with trackers. I may be wrong.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was another thing. Some of the radios would be filled with explosives, and when they were robbed, the store owner knew not to sell them to local people. And when the guerrillas took them, they go and switch it on, and boom, off they'd go. There were other ways. Poison clothing, again. Clothing would be saturated in poison, toxic material, and left in a store. Again, the guerrillas would steal that, put it on, and eventually, I think the poison they used was something called thardin, pretty nasty. They're more irritation than the standard strategy, the sort of thing. But yeah, we did come across a guerrilla once who we could only assume put this poison clothing on, and it wasn't long for this world when we came across him. We just fled. We left him. We didn't want to go near the guy. Yeah, it wasn't common, but certainly jarking radios was an extremely successful tactic, yeah.
The war attracted quite a few foreigners to fight in the RLI and the Rhodesian forces generally. And these came from places like Vietnam and Northern Ireland veterans and others from all around the world. What were these guys like generally?
Generally, good guys. Certainly the Brits, most of whom, as you say, had all done tours in Northern Ireland, been into places like Borneo and various other places, Cyprus, places like that, Aden. They were good guys. Vietnam vets generally were good guys, but quite a few blokes were not really up to it. But yeah, good guys. As you say, there were a lot of commonalities and similarities between Vietnam and Rhodesia in terms of the type of warfare involved. A lot of Aussies and Kiwis who'd also been in Vietnam came and joined us. In fact, the RLI attracted, and certainly my commander, 3 Commander, had a lot of foreigners in it. I would say 25% or more.
That's high.
Yeah, it's high. I mean, the RLI originally started as mainly with South Africans. They tended to fade out as the South African war intensified and the South Africans needed their own people. But yeah, there were a lot of foreigners, and certainly in the RLI, I think at one stage our CO counted like 18 different nationalities fighting in the RLI, and that included, as I say, Brits, Canadians, Americans, a lot of Canadians too, Aussies, Kiwis, Europeans, few guys from the Foreign Legion, lots. There's even an Inuit, an Eskimo, apparently. Thank you.
You couldn't get that. Is almost bizarre. I did laugh at the nicknames the different commandos had. Was your commando the Lovers or something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, and that's all associated with the banana. I mean, the subtle. I don't know where it came from. I think the RLI was doing a parade in South Africa one day, and they always had rather sort of good-looking OCs, smooth guys. So that's where that came from. Yeah.
In February 1977, your conscription period was up and you signed on as a regular for a 3-year contract. You were once a very sceptical and reluctant soldier, so what made you do this?
Yeah, mad, isn't it? I mean, I could have left and gone to university, but I think I was actually quite starting to like soldiering. I was, and I think I was okay. I think I was doing well. And peer pressure as well. Most of my mates were regulars. And, I think that's why I signed up. I mean, totally against the run of play. I shouldn't have, but I did. And I think the sort of last 2 years of my RLI service was as a regular. And in the main, I enjoyed it. Absolutely loved it. Yeah, that's why.
In spring 1977, you took part in Operation Grand Reef, in which your unit suffered a number of casualties, and you described the aftermath as follows. When we reached the dismembered guerrillas, we went through the ritual of looting the corpses. As usual, the flies had beaten us to it. I rolled one of the bodies onto its back and went through the routine with hardly a thought. First the shirt pockets, then the trouser pockets, front and back, both pairs. It was common for the guerrillas to wear more than one pair at a time. I found about $40. The notes dirtied and bloodied and divided into 3. Then you go on to say, the rest of that day passed like a dream. I can hazily remember the journey back to base at Grand Reef, lying amidst the Tussle parachutes in the back of the truck in an effort to keep out the evening cold. As the vehicle bumped its way along the road, I tried to shed a tear for Trevor, but I found I couldn't. Something deep inside was keeping everything bottled up. I was stunned, of course, but even now I'm bewildered at my lack of grief. Maybe it was our training, or perhaps grief simply can't be switched on and off like a tap. Maybe my own survival came first. I got the impression, rightly or wrongly, that this was when the war started to really affect you and caused a hardening of your attitude. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so, Colin. Yeah. It's when you get sort of death and injury, close up and personal, which was how it was, and especially when your own guys get shot. So yes, I think it definitely started affecting me then, and definitely caused a hardening of my attitude. Certainly not racial attitude or anything like that. It was more of a survival attitude that this was getting serious, and that I definitely had to sort of tighten up there. Getting back to looting the bodies, that was a common practice. And at the time, the Rhodesian dollar was on par with the US dollar. In fact, at one stage, it was even stronger than the US dollar. So $40 was a lot of money in those days. These guys, the guerrillas, always had fancy watches that they'd stolen or, brought with them. Fancy watches had a lot of money, which also been stolen, or sometimes you got lucky and you hit a paymaster, a Zanla paymaster, and that sometimes amounted to thousands. I never was fortunate enough to come across that. Yeah, we plundered what we could. If we didn't, it would all be taken by special branch.
Again, for civilians who might not know, I mean, this is nothing unusual. My grandfather fought in the Second World War, and he described going into Germany and they were helping themselves. It was just seen as part of what soldiers do. So it's not a criticism in any way, shape or form. And I think, again, it comes down to that hardening of attitudes, doesn't it? It becomes not an SOP, but you just, a lot of the time your attitudes harden, I think, because you're trying to protect yourself. Do you know where I'm coming from, Chris? It's a self-protection mechanism, I think, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think you've nailed it with your hardening of attitudes, hardening of your being. You become a killer, a professional killer, absolutely. And to do that, you have to have a fairly sort of hardened attitude, a hardened demeanor of being able to do that,
And it's not something you can switch on and off like a tap. And this is what annoys me sometimes. They send young men and women to war these days and expect them to become killers in the battle space, then come back to Civvy Street and just switch it all off. And you just cannot do that.
No, absolutely. And I mean, certainly in the 70s, that kind of thing was, the way it was dealt with was fairly primitive. It wasn't dealt with at all. I don't think it's changed too much, that there is no kind of, when you finished your time, when you finished your war, that there's no way of decompressing, basically, and coming out of that whole mindset. And it lives with you forever.
And we spoke earlier about parallels with Vietnam, but in your book there are also parallels with the war in Afghanistan. And you go to write, Smith grabbed the leading man's hair from the back and yanked him upright. He thrust the muzzle of his FN against the base of the man's skull. The guerrilla's eyes widened in horror. Smith pulled the trigger. The body was thrown violently forward as the head disintegrated in a shower of blood and brains. The guerrilla twitched briefly and then was still. Times had changed. A year ago we might have saved him, but not in 1979. We didn't want captures who might only get a prison sentence after all our efforts, or even be reprieved and integrated into the army as a reformed ally. Execution in the field, we rationalised, saved the troops extra work, to say nothing of taxpayers' money. The officers said that Special Branch badly needed captures for information purposes, but the intelligence we got in the field always seemed out of date and second grade anyway, so what did it matter? Beside that, a whole chopper would have been taken up to Kazavak-Hem, which meant a stick would have to stay out overnight. Do you think there's a culmination point in guerrilla warfare where we've talked about soldiers becoming hardened to death? The cause seems futile and victory uncertain, leading to these type of incidents. And secondly, what advice would you give to a serving soldier involved in an insurgency war like Rhodesia or Afghanistan?
Yeah, I think that whole attitude, where I look back and it was wrong. I mean, the Special Branch did need captures, and the intelligence they did provide was often good. Certainly if they could turn that guerrilla, and you could end up working in possibly the Selous Scouts. But yeah, it was very much a hardening of attitudes. Our immediate needs were overruled everything. So if we captured him or he was wounded, he'd have to take up a helicopter to be evacuated from the contact area, which might mean we would miss out on our lift back to base and have to sleep out in the bush that night. It was basic things like that we did that sort of thing. It wasn't common, but it became more and more common as the war progressed, and we became more and more ruthless. I mean, almost, ruthless is probably not the word, but absolutely, I'm trying to think of the word that would describe us, how we became. But yeah, it's certainly hardened to that kind of thing.
I think, again, for civilians who might be just thinking, who can't understand this, but I think soldiering can be boiled down to three basic component parts, and that is getting enough sleep, getting stuff to eat, and staying alive. It becomes a very primitive existence in some ways.
Yeah, you absolutely nailed it. Sleep, food, and to live. Exactly. Primitive is certainly the word, the primitive almost mindset to survive the next day, basically. And that goes on, what advice would you give to a serving soldier in insurgency wars like Rhodesia or Afghanistan? Number one is complacency. It doesn't matter your experience, your level of service, how long you've been in the army. It's a 1 minute, a 1 second lapse in attention or complacently can cause your death. That's all. But definitely it became very much a case of simplistic, almost survival mechanism. Sadly, the I wouldn't say the atrocities, but those kind of incidents certainly increased as the war progressed, and the whole army became almost absolutely hardened to the brutality of the whole thing.
And you're seeing that in Afghanistan as well, with some of the stuff that's been coming out over the last few years. And going back to your statement there about, and my statement about things go very basic during operational tours. Everything is simple. But again, I think it was Clausewitz said, everything in war is simple, but even the simplest things are difficult. And I think that's always a favourite saying of mine, to do things well, you need to just keep that focus that you mentioned.
Exactly. And I mean, as you would know, a lot of your decisions in action are split-second decisions. You're not having time to look at the implications of them. I mean, we didn't have what the rules of engagement. We didn't know what that meant. That term wasn't invented then. It was all common sense, and you would be making these split-second decisions, life or death decisions, basically, and you are not thinking of the ramifications or implications months, years down the line of those decisions.
Yeah, that's a great point. It boils my blood when soldiers from the British Army are getting hauled through courts for things they made in those type of moments you described there in Northern Ireland.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's like all these Aussie SAS guys who are being stripped of all their medals for various atrocities and things like that in Afghanistan. I do not judge them whatsoever. I'm not saying I condone what they did, but absolutely you can fully understand the situation there.
I think that's a great phrase you use there. I'm not going to judge and I'm not going to condone, because you can't, because you weren't there. And I think that's when I talk to any soldier about the military experience, I think that's something I stick by.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the political reasonings years after the event that is just sickening, really.
You were promoted to NCO and you served 3 years in an elite unit in intense guerrilla war. I think one thing that strikes me in your book, and you saw when the withdrawal from Afghanistan happened a couple of years ago, it affected a lot of British and American veterans. But as a double blow for Rhodesia, because not only was a war lost, but a country was lost. And you were deeply influenced by your experiences. And going back to what we discussed earlier on about your hardening of attitudes and what you experienced in the battle space, that comes at a price, and this is made clear when you write. More than any other sensory recollection, it's the smells that linger. The smell of fresh, sweet blood. The smell of intestines scattered in the dust with a feeding swarm of blue flies buzzing lazily and unafraid. The smell of shit in a corpse. The chemical smells of frantan, phosphorus, plastic explosive, cordite, avgas and diesel. Of onions and garlic. Of marijuana and beer. Of sweat and semen and piss. You never escape the smells. And of course, the music is as equally evocative. ABBA's Dancing Queen, Kate Bush's Wuthering Heights, Leo Sayers' Dancing the Night Away, ELO's Living Thing and Mr. Blue Sky, David Parton's Isn't She Lovely, Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons, Who Loves You, Tina Charles' I Love to Love, and of course that massive LP by Fleetwood Mac, Rumours, which takes me right back to Dorwa and Jerry shooting the ammo thief. Players' 1977 Baby Come Back, that transports me to the Mark 8 Grand Reef and shooting up with morphine, music to kill by. I thought they were both very, very powerful paragraphs that get across the horror of war, the music that takes you straight back, and every soldier who's been in an operation has their own musical soundtrack. You know, I saw a meme on social media recently where it showed you inside of a Huey, and there was a button that in the helicopter control panel that you could flick, and it would play Creedence Clearwater's "Fortunate Son." So there's that musical soundtrack. But obviously, the war affected you, Chris. So looking back on it now, what were those effects?
I didn't understand how it affected me for a long time, for many years. I just thought I was a failure. I couldn't fit into Civvy Street. I couldn't get a job. It was only when, that word PTSD, that expression came into being, that I started to possibly think that maybe I was suffering from it. They do say it takes sometimes up to 30 years before PTSD can really affect you. I think there's the immediate post-war, post-combat experience of several months, even years after that, when you feel absolutely lost. You know, the war had become your whole being, even though it was only 3 years. Well, in my case, it was nearly 5 after the RLI. I did more service, but yeah, that whole period, and especially from your sort of aged 18 to 22, the very impressionable age, you're still a boy, really, and it had become your whole life was the war. And so several years afterwards, you're just drifting. You don't know where you are, how you fit in. You still get reminded the whole time of what happened, all the sights and the sounds, and, you know, the classic car backfiring and everyone dives for cover, you know, that kind of thing. It did affect me, perhaps a lot more than I ever thought it would. And it manifested itself in my late 20s and into my 30s, mainly with sort of massive substance abuse. I couldn't maintain relationships. I couldn't hold down a job. Yeah, and it did. It definitely affected me. I had counselling a couple of years ago. The RLI paid for me to have, the RLI Association paid for me to have PTSD counselling, which helped. But, you know, I think it's too ingrained in you, the PTSD. You're never going to cure it as such, but it's learning how to manage it. And hopefully I've learned how to do that. But without doubt, it affected me. The whole nightmares aspect as well. I mean, those go away eventually, but certainly for several years after the conflict, it's not uncommon, and the nightmares and that sort of thing. I mean, not an easy person to live with for my wife or girlfriend. Yeah,
I read a thing recently, a couple of years ago, and it was saying that males don't fully mature until they're about 22 or 23, which coincidentally, you've got all these guys who take part in wars. Majority of them are 18 to 22, 23. And you've seen that in Afghanistan, the trouble that veterans are having from that war. And I think, you know, you mentioned there about you having all these intensive experiences before you're that age of where you are fully mature, fully rounded human being. So it is only going to affect you. And we had a friend of mine on who was a contact to Northern Ireland that gave him PTSD, and this was in 1988, 89. And again, going back to, we didn't know what it was back then. And I described in one of our podcast episodes how our guys that had PTSD from Northern Ireland, and we were all single living in a block, we'd put them all in one room down at the end of the corridor so they could, you know, to try and lump them away from us because they were having nightmares at night. He went and he pretended he had a bad back and he was going to see a military psychologist, and this officer told him, you need to get a grip, this is what we do. So even 10 years after your experiences, that problem was still there in the British Army, and I think it's only recently in the last 20 years that people are starting to take it seriously and trying to get people the help they need, but sometimes it's just inadequate.
Exactly. It's amazed me that it's taken so long for this to transpire, that dealing with PTSD is a real thing. I mean, the state of the veterans, I believe, in the UK is just shocking. It really is. I mean, homeless, it's just awful. It's not a good thing, and I don't know if there's, you know, any particular way that it can be dealt with other than counselling. But again, time, money, all that kind of thing.
I'll talk about your book in a minute, Chris, Fire Force. But you've also got a second book out called Survival Course, which I'm hopefully, if you're agreeable, we'll come on and we'll do a second podcast about your life after these experiences we've described. So I'm trying to hound you into coming on again. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, be honoured. Yeah, it's a very dark book. As I say, it takes place from my end of my time at the RLI into what was called PAR2, the Police Anti-Terrorist Unit, which was a sort of police paramilitary unit, very much similar operations to RLI, but without air support. I'd absolutely be on it. And it deals with the whole PTSD and trying to come to terms with myself in a post-war life.
That's fantastic. I look forward to reading that. As usual, we're going to finish off with Desert Island Debts, which is a guest choice of book, film and luxury item. So what have you picked for us on this episode, Chris?
My book choice would undoubtedly be Chicken Hawk, Robert Mason, the most powerful war book I've ever read. Really was. I don't know if you've read it.
I've read it, yeah.
Yeah, what a book. He was one of the pioneers in the first Cavalry Division Air Mobile, the first CAV, as they called it. And so he was involved in the 66 operations in Ankei and Yadrang, but absolutely graphic. And again, similarly, he has a sequel, and he talks about his post-traumatic stress disorder and his criminal activities and that sort of thing. But yeah, without doubt, the book for me. A couple of months ago, I was talking to an ex-Rhodesian helicopter pilot who'd been on Fire Force operations. He was quite a senior guy, and he agreed with me. He said that Chicken Hawk was absolutely harrowing, and what those helicopter pilots did, I mean, using their helicopter blades to chop down the LZs or LZs, just amazing flying, amazing.
Yeah, and it was, it was the first sort of proper. That's no problem. It was the first proper helicopter war, really, as well, wasn't it? It sort of set the precedence. And your film choice?
Okay, a little bit left field. It's a Russian or Soviet film called Come and See. The production house was Mosfilm and Belarus Film. It was filmed in 1985, and I find a lot of those Soviet war movies are just superb, absolutely superb. There's several, there's lots. Another one was They Fought for Their Country, based on a true story, trying to deal with the German invasion in Barbarossa. This particular one, Come and See, takes place in Belarus, and the tagline at the end of the movie says it all. 628 Belarusian villages were destroyed in 1941. But when I mean destroyed, absolutely destroyed from the face of the earth by the Germans. And this particular movie is about a group of partisans in Belarusia, as it was, fighting the Germans, again based on true stories. And what I love about these Soviet movies is the cinematography is just superb, absolutely unreal, better than Hollywood, I believe. Extremely graphic, but not gratuitous. Just tell it how it was. Yeah, just too awful. But what a movie. Come and see. And the Soviets spared no expense in those movies. I mean, for example, in War and Peace. I don't know if you've seen War and Peace. I haven't. It's on my wish list. But apparently for the Battle of Borodino, they used 120,000 extras.
Wow.
And the battle lasted an hour on the movie. And those extras were all Soviet troops, serving Soviet troops.
Yeah.
So they had an unlimited supply of extras for their war movies. And I don't know how they did it, but they used proper Panzers, Panzer IVs, Panzer IIIs, Tigers. They look totally real. They're not cheap and nasties. They really are spare no expense. The one thing is don't watch any dubbed versions. Rather watch the one with
subtitles.
Yeah, dubbed appalling. But yeah, what a movie. And you come away from that just absolutely gobsmacked. You're gutted. You're absolutely gutted. Yeah, that's my movie. Come and see.
Yeah, and you can get that on YouTube, subtitled on YouTube. And as you say, Chris, it's extremely powerful. And I'm partway through reading David Dimbleby's new book about the Russian involvement in World War II. The scale of it is just, you can't comprehend it. the figures that come off the page, it's just the scale of the suffering and everything else. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Soviets, 9 out of 10 Germans who were killed by the Soviets. That just says the scale of the whole situation. We have no comprehension or very little of the Soviet involvement in World War II. I mean, we thought D-Day was a big deal. It was little.
And that's no disrespect to those guys, but for the Russians, that was a sideshow, wasn't it? That was an absolute sideshow to them.
Exactly. Eastern Front was where it was at. Total war. Yeah.
And luxury item?
Well, I don't know if it's allowed, but I'd like to take a tablet, iPad or something, with access to YouTube. I love my music, as you can see from all the songs, and that's my major form of relaxation, is watching music on YouTube. So that's what I would do, yeah.
My guess never failed to surprise me. I thought you were going to come up with some sort of fancy Rhodesian hunting knife or something. But that is a pretty left field choice, Chris, so you can have that one.
Thank you. And obviously I could watch all the Mosville movies as well.
So my choice is Chris's book, Fire Force. And
oh, well, yeah.
No, absolutely, Chris. And it's, I'm not just doing this because you're the guest sat in front of me. I've always been interested in the Rhodesian War, and for a whole host of reasons. For a lay person, the thought of carrying out those fire force operations looks exciting, and all the other bits and pieces, and it's like pure soldiering. Yeah, as you said earlier, it was a section commander's war. But what you also get from your book is it's a visceral and riveting account of that war, and it should be better known. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't, try to think of the right adjective, it just wasn't what you think when you start reading about the effect it had on you and the brutal realities of it, and it should be better known. So I can highly recommend it. And where can listeners get a copy of it, Chris?
It's available on Amazon, Amazon worldwide, any Amazon. You look for Fire Force as 2 words, and then probably type in Chris Cox afterwards, because there are lots of other Fire Forces, kids' games and things like that. Yeah, Amazon, I think Apple have it on their platform, Barnes & Noble on their platform. Yeah, pretty well anywhere online, yeah.
And that'll be the same as your other book survival course as well. And I know we're doing a future episode on it, but what I'll do in the show notes, I'll put in links for both books so people can get access to them.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks to Chris for coming on the podcast, and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email, social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you've downloaded us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcasts from. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continued help in offering technical support through his company ISAR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.